Yeah, welcome back to High Performance Computing, Lecture 0, our prologue of the course. While in the first lecture we really had a rough overview what high performance computing means, and we had several aspects about course organization. So what are the assignments, what are the exams, what we do it with quizzes and Canvas and so forth. The second part is really more about content of the course. And of course, that will be not a detailed introduction. It will be just a really rough overview about each of the different slides to really show you a little bit what we cover in this course. Each of the lectures will be very detailed, of course, then in the end, when we have this different lectures and take away the message that some of these lectures we really will have in much more detail than just having a lecture like today. We will have practical lectures, we'll have demonstrations of technology. I will make really basically a process to you known how to really start from C programming, going then to compiling, and from compiling, submitting it on a HPC system to have a whole process, but then also learn how to submit deep learning jobs. We will learn how to use MPI, OpenMP in those parallel programs with different certain assignments. So we'll be really not only those lectures that are present here now in the content. And before I go to the different elements of each and every single lecture, let me just say that, of course, this material of the course is taught since 2013. So we have really lots of experience teaching it. We got lots of years of incorporating many of the student feedbacks. The idea how we structure the lectures, you will see every now and then we change a little bit the ordering. We introduced new kind of ideas of basically technologies that we're going to teach. And you have here two examples if you want to go back a little bit to the old courses. So you see HPC course fall 2017, that is still on my website. And we here and there have, of course, then always switched a little bit with the evolution in time and the importance really of the different contents. Then a little bit the lectures, but the key idea of the course was, let's say, the really paradigms that are still valid today, like MPI, like OpenMP, and like GPUs. This really stand the test of time, as well as the domain application problems. You see here in the old courses, we already teach terrestrial systems, systems biology, molecular systems, and so on, computational fluid dynamics, of course. And also a certain aspect always with machine learning and data mining. While, of course, deep learning becomes now more prominent, so we integrate it in more recent parts of the course. And because we have also the COVID-19 crisis, we have now AI in health and neurosciences as well, as basically looking a little bit more into the medical sector, which is an important field today in high-performance computing. So fasten your seatbelt through quick walkthrough what will happen essentially in our different lectures here when we go from lecture 1 to 16. So lecture 1 will start with a really, let's say, rough overview about high performance computing, but then digging deeper. So we will always think about, okay, what is the top 500 list, which is several different supercomputers, and they have lots of cores. But what really are those architectures? So we will look into this and we'll see what really is the main way of handling parallelization, really. So is it shared memory, storing variables always to a shared space, or is it distributed memory, really message exchanges a lot? Or it's even, let's say, more emerging also combinations of those where you use this. Of course, more recently, we have also GPUs alongside accelerators, which also may have an impact into HPC architectures. And all of this we have to look together and see a little bit in the first lecture, really as an introductory topic, how then parallel applications and also infrastructures which offer those systems are materializing in terms of HPC systems, or as HPC simulation science software, or even as deep learning packages that can use HPC architectures. And with this, we're going into a domain which is very broad in HPC and incredibly important. It is the whole HPC ecosystem around it. HPC, in a way, is not just a little bit of course bound together by InfiniBand or by a very good network and then putting some GPUs to it. It is a whole software environment, including scheduling, performance analysis tools, different libraries in the scientific domain. So you will see that this HPC system is a modular system with the modules for software, has so many parts in it that really to handle this complexity, you have to understand several different aspects of it. And when we go there, we will also understand more the different role, for instance, of international HPC projects that drive several different technologies, let it be software or being more on the hardware and let's say prototype front, or for instance, going and moving to exascale performance, which we have right today. Beyond exascale on the horizon of the future, already the use of quantum computing systems. We already publish here and there and working on the D-Wave quantum annealer. And we will have a D-Wave quantum annealer in Jülich also very soon. So really see their system, which was, let's say, previously unthinkable, maybe already being, daily used. It was more a kind of theory that this will be coming every time and then. But now with a quantum annealing approach, we have really a chance of going then and explore the quantum computing world where optimization problems can be very quickly solved, for instance. Even if it would be not a general processing technology, for several aspects, like for instance, when you have deep learning optimization problems these days, you can really use a quantum computing systems. I gave a keynote last year in the UT Messe about quantum computing. If you're interested, you find that talk on YouTube. In lecture 1, based on this, let's say, more general knowledge, we will now dive into one very important idea, how you program in parallel. And this will be starting with a message passing interface. It's a distributed memory way of approaching parallelization. You would have different functions to really pass a message, which means essentially these red things here you see between the different cores from one core to another. Let it be in a one-to-one or with a collective maybe that you see here in broadcast manner to all other cores, maybe from one. So there are different aspects to it. We will understand MPI ranks. We will have a rough understanding of communicators, which we will then in depth have more in other, let's say, lectures which are coming after it. So it really will establish the basics of what MPI is, how you can use it for parallel programming. And needless to say that one of your first tasks in this course will be to create your own little MPI program, the hello world in parallel that we really need, but also going beyond this in the assignment, of course, a little bit, but still having then known already how to create a small C program, how compile it, and also then use it with MPI libraries in order to execute several messages while you are executing it via a scheduler in parallel then on this HPC machines. So it will be quite something that you already learn out of lecture 2. And of course, then lecture 3 will basically provide you some add-on capabilities. So thinking much more clearly what parallelization could entail. Perhaps also a bit more broader picture what it can entail, because many people will always think parallelization can be chopped down into different pieces. So you would say, and these would be homogeneous pieces. You see here, for instance, when we want to have sorting this array, maybe we can have it just, with 4 cores equally separated and then taking maybe the maximum from all of these if you want, or sorting it and do this in parallel. But we will also see that parallelization from a broader perspective could be also thinking about large workflows. You see that here, essentially where all of the different pieces are executed in parallel, then contributed to a larger bit. And this could be a form of parallelization. And also what you see here in particles, when we want to have several particles maybe, simulated. And we will come back to this when we talk about, particles in the domain specific section. But you could say that particles which are very close to the particle of interest could be, let's say, very accurately simulated of saying it really remains a particle. But while, long range interactions as those we call here, or this could be maybe averaged across all of these different 4 particles. So there is no need in this long range interactions maybe to really have a totally detailed representation of the particles in the domain. Hence, what we talk about here is maybe much more a tree approach, right? Where you have the particle here, the several nodes which are the close interactions where, the force, the energy between those matter, but the long range interactions might be not so important and then in different parts of the tree. So this is the topic we will talk roughly only about to understand that parallelization could be many different aspects and what it means to have really data parallelism and functional parallelism methods. It is a more theoretical lecture, perhaps, because we'll also talk then about several of the aspects of speed up. What does this term mean? What does it mean if you have a serial part and a parallel part of a program? We'll have the problems that we will encounter more and more in these days with Amdahl's law, for instance, or basically the general idea of measuring performance of scalability metrics, that we need to show that really our program scales. So different terms need to be used there that we will allude to, which are maybe a bit more considered as a theoretical topic, but have, of course, a significant practical impact. Then in lecture 4, we really go more again into advanced MPI techniques, and there are quite many of those I could teach. Here I took 2 which are, let's say, on a reasonable level of detail. So we will really use that already in our assignments. And this is something why I basically teach that 2 topics here a little bit more in detail, while many other advanced MPI techniques exists. But you will use the Cartesian communicator that you see here. It doesn't mean anything to you yet, but we will see how that materializes when we come to this lecture, where you maybe want to several domains simulated and then have a structured way how to basically perform then this message exchanges over them over time in an iterative, let's say, process. When you have a simulation, let's say you want a wave propagation of an ocean wave across this tile of these 12 ocean patches, if you want, and you want to have a principled way how you do this, you can use MPI with a Cartesian communicator of basically distributing this, not worrying too much now what is really my core there on the physical device. You have basically a software abstraction that helps you significantly in this. And we will talk about, and of course also talk about how this now reflects the internal machine network interconnect and have some application examples. However, we will see also later and also in your assignment, the application could be manifold. You can see that, of course, this domain could be an ocean, but we could also talk about terrestrial, let's say Earth coverage in some way where you want to have something in a regular pattern. Then on the other end, while this is much more computing and interactions and message exchanges, on the other end, we have always a question of data these days. So what we do with all the simulated data, you compute a lot, and what you do with the results. You will see that there are different I/O terminologies and, let's say, aspects how you can do it, which raise to several challenges, where you maybe are stuck and can say that when you have lots of processes that you see here and they all should write to the disk at the same time, you would see that the disk might have some problems of creating so many files, so many inodes. It depends, of course, if you have, let's say, millions here maybe of processes which are taking place, and then really your disk need to operate in a parallel manner. So what there was basically established with very known file formats like HDF5, for instance, or the NetCDF parallel file format. This is more something where you basically collect all the different aspects computed in a sort of parallel file, right, which you can parallel access. And the libraries are there to help you in this, to really use higher level I/O libraries in order to have, let's say, an interesting dump to disk, which is not separated over billions of processor files, but rather have one parallel file format file where basically all concurrently those processes can write in. So this is something which you, of course, partly explore here in the course, maybe not on the big data scale, because we are still here in a teaching environment, not in a production environment, but you will learn the lesson why parallel I/O is a significant technique today, which will also come back here now and then when we go to the domain-specific techniques. In Parallel 5, then we have some interesting aspects how you do parallel algorithms when you think about some application examples on the one hand, just to really understand better what we learned from the topics before. While you are busy maybe with your first application, with your first assignment in the course, we'll learn about some other examples like fast Fourier transform, or maybe also using a matrix vector multiplication in parallel to really understand and get more a feeling what parallel algorithms really are. And this is an important part. Also the use of MPI collectives, which are significant performance improvements and compared to, let's say, always one-to-one messages. So this is an important part of this. Then the other part of it is that still you're a programmer, right, to implement parallel programs, maybe in certain domain sciences, like here, the construction and engineering of a Formula One race car. But for this, you mean to have lots of physical variables always distributed between all the cores you see here. And for this, you don't want to be sticked with an integer, right? And then say, I always submit just one integer or a real number, whatever it is, a double. So the point here is creating higher level data structures based on so-called MPI data types. And then from this derived MPI data types that you see a little bit alluded here, which then are interesting complex data types, which enables you then to have in this message exchanges on a regular fashion as a new data type. And with this, of course, are not really bound to this, let's say, primitive data types that you have usually in programming. So it makes things a little bit more better from the code point of view. And of course, if you think the overhead of messages in MPI, then instead of maybe sending lots of different messages, you can just send one message with this new MPI derived MPI data type. So that is more an impact in terms of conceptual aspects, how you really program these things, but incredibly important to get more and more a feeling how really parallel computing works. Then in lecture 6, we a little bit conclude the aspect of distributed memory and go to another paradigm, which is interestingly enough conceptually different, but often combined with distributed memory. We talk about the aspect of shared memory, and some of you may have already done this in previous courses or already, let's say, in private when you think about having thread programming in Unix or thread programming in Java. So here and there you can compare this certainly to shared memory programming, but there's one specific tool and implementation that we have here, OpenMP, that's really a standard, if you want, like the MPI standard in HPC for doing shared memory programming here. So we have so-called pragma statements, which then can enable several parts of your C program to run in parallel in these different threads that we then have on the processes. We can basically have different aspects of securing our memory for certain overrides, lost updates, and certain things for critical region protection where you want to have variables secured. We will learn how to fork and join, how to have basically different worker ideas that are all contributing to then the master overall idea of the program. We will talk a bit about portability, and then of course the differences to distributed memory. By having these basics, then really we look into how you program OpenMP. So this is not only of saying I want to have pragma and then in parallel hello world. We will see it's much more richer. We have variables which are then specifically protected in loops, which could be executed in parallel over different processes. We will learn about this in lecture 6. And then here and there, we will see with simple applications how we also can make comparisons with MPI. So an important aspect, and if you want to tune really to the very best your simulation sciences source code today, I mean, this is one way to do it. You would think about what you see here, that you use MPI, really the MPI standard between different nodes of your architecture, which all have parallel processes, and within those nodes, you will program OpenMP. Now, when doing so, it sounds so easy from a 10,000 feet perspective, but take along the message that there's lots of hidden gems when you do parallel programming, especially hybrid programming, which is not easy. You will have different vector and task modes to think about, and then think about that today you maybe even want to combine also GPUs. So you would have then also device memory that needs to be filled at certain point of time to upload it to GPUs and certain things like this. But also, on the other hand, you have to think about that in this programming patterns that you use, perhaps both with MPI and OpenMP, you would have certain programming patterns, nearest neighbor communications, and in general, what you see here also, this kind of iterative approach over time. You would say that here T0, what you see in the front, in order to compute the next time step in let's say T1 that you see here, you really need the nearest neighbor information for it to really have the calculated time. let's say that you simulate our water that we discussed with the ocean waves, you can only compute the height of the ocean wave here if you have the surrounding neighbors, if you know what's happened. But of course, you don't want to know what's happened in the same time step. In order to compute the next time step, you need the data that was in the previous time step in these neighboring tiles in order to be accurate, let's say also in the next time step in your own tile. And these has different, let's say, wordings and different patterns, really, like the stencil-based iterative methods that we allude here a little bit, but also the idea of halo regions. So what you do when you have an ocean that you would basically want to simulate across all of these different processes, and you have an ocean tile that is suddenly ending, so to speak, in one node, because you cannot access the memory of the other. You cannot access simply the nearest neighbor of the other. It is in another node. You have to think about so-called halo regions to get these different time steps filled. This is admittedly already a little bit more complex topic, so hence we have a whole lecture on this with patterns and then hybrid programming. But it's really important that you understand what halo regions are. They're incredibly often used in physical applications. And then we will talk about also different, let's say, programming patterns, but also Cartesian communicator shifts again, and so forth. So a more, let's say, conceptual idea is really to think about when we now know MPI, when we know OpenMP, how we program that all. And of course, you can imagine that now debugging techniques are completely different in a way than you just have it on a serial computer, because here you just do a dump maybe of your memory, you see all the variables that you have, and a good debugging tool can really show you a lot. Now here we have to think about that there are specific tools to really support the whole software life cycle, where you maybe start with performance analysis to understand your program, how it works on all the different cores. Then you would tune it and see some load imbalance in the cores, a term we already have by then really known by heart, where we will try to balance more the computing and then maybe come to an optimized application that we then want to measure in order to have, again, a performance analysis. So that means that when you go to really production codes, to really large scientific simulation codes, there you really need an iterative process to understand it, to tune it, because then it's not only just, let's say, 5 processes here that maybe have a very strange message exchange. You see here essentially that in order to send the message on this, it is waiting for the message to be sent on one that will come also in the future. So this is essentially a critical deadlock we talk about here. So in this sense, these are problems that in a couple of processes, you may identify that very quickly. But if you have, let's say, thousands of processes in a very large scale simulation, this is very hard to look at in manual. So you need specific performance analysis tools like Scholastica, for instance, we will look at in order to understand your basically performance problems, or essentially your whole execution on parallel systems as a whole. And we will see that there are different aspects to it where we really can profile what's happening, and with this really understand what's happening and even identify certain profiles like a late sender, for instance, when you have basically different message exchanges in this parallel program. So this will be also more an advanced topic. And of course, as we have a teaching topic here, you could have 3 days of performance analysis workshops, right? So this means we will look from this, of course, from a very, let's say, easy perspective, just to understand the basic concepts. Of course, these tools begin to be much more crucial and critical if you move from a hello world on 4 processes to really thousands of processes for a physics simulation of a turbine that is basically shown here. So, and this is of course valid not only essentially for MPI and OpenMP. These days also GPUs play a role where this technique is also more and more important to analyze. Hence, we go to the next topic, which is then really the introduction to graphical processing units. We talked roughly about it before, but in order to understand it, there are certain aspects to it. First of all, understanding the difference, of course, between a multi-core processor to a many-core processor, where there are maybe hundreds of, let's say, cores, which are, let's say, of moderate performance. But here, really, the throughput, again, is a very important part. we were seeing that with NVIDIA, there was a certain amount of architectures really driven forward very quickly from Kepler, Pascal, and Volta. We will look at these differences, understanding that GPUs really heavily increased from their origin, where maybe they were just thought for gaming. They are really now cutting edge technology for executing deep learning, machine learning, really for large scale data sets, which is an incredible architecture pace. If you look on the way that this is essentially something which just came in the last decade, really broadly available on the market to an affordable price. Still today, GPUs are quite expensive, especially if you want to have the cutting edge ones. And there are different ways how you also think about this now today, because NVIDIA is, let's say, more the dominant market provider, but more and more come along which try to have also accelerators on the market. With this, we have also other programming paradigms, not only CUDA, which is the specific basically programming model for NVIDIA GPUs. We will also talk a little bit about OpenMP and about HIP, and then think about different GPU tool sets. We'll talk also about the limits of GPUs, think about GPU direct and interfaces where you really can talk essentially from device memory to device memory by having just a quick hop over the host CPUs, because usually we have here a bottleneck that is a bit like shown here, that we always have to transfer data from the host CPU memory to the device memory here. And as this connection is, let's say, not so fast, this is a key bottleneck today. So the GPU direct interfaces enable us to use the CPU or the host CPU more or less as a network interface and just send immediately data from GPU to another one. And this is something we will a little bit talk about, and then just to show you a little bit the limits that also GPUs have. But for a high performance computing system, this is of course very important. You see here one application example where we used in one of our papers really an interesting remote sensing data set. But we interconnected 96 GPUs to really break down the computing. And you see here the time in computing on different HPC systems, Juvales and Jureka. And essentially you see how we break down how we achieve a speed up here really by having more and more GPUs in the nodes together. These were 24 nodes with 4 GPUs each, used all with the same deep learning training and Horowat, which is a parallel software framework of making this happen. So this is really high performance computing today. You go beyond one GPU, although the GPU inherent is already a many core GPU, a many core architecture, many core chip really, which already inherently does parallelization. So we have here parallelization on different levels, if you will. In lecture 10, then we think about parallel and scalable machine and deep learning a bit more. So thinking about that this is, of course, a technology today very attractive. You have heard that more and more jobs probably are more, in this area of data sciences, data specialists, and are incredibly required on the market. So here we will talk about how we use HPC for classification tasks. Here you see an example. So what type of land cover is it? Is it a road? Is it a building? Is it water? And you see the different classes, and we use these different classes to train a deep learning network, but maybe also traditional classifiers like support vector machines we published here in order to understand when we have the next image of what terrain it really is. Clustering, you see here a human brain part where there are different, let's say, cortical layers where we want to identify when are these cortical layers actually changing for different functionality in the human brain. And you can look at this, that this has relationships to the different, let's say, distances between the cores in basically all of these cells. So you can have clustering algorithms like the DB-scan algorithm working on this, on the density-based approach that we then do also in parallel, as we published here as one of the significant papers in one of the supercomputing conferences. But once you do this, you also have to think about maybe not all data fits into your memory. You do it again across many different CPUs. So you definitively have to think about load balancing and load imbalance, which we will look at this, even if you have a data intensive problem, and how you basically then do a domain decomposition, which makes it then a bit more than load balanced again. Well, this will be mostly data science domain problems where we talk about, so less physical problems, really analyzing data like here hyperspectral data sets from a satellite image. Also, lecture 11 is a little bit data science driven. You could do the human brain project with several different simulations. We will also have a little bit as an outlook, but here we look firstly on COVID-19, so on chest x-rays, and see how deep learning there can work. We integrated this here in the lecture series because it's a very, let's say, concrete and very, let's say, active and lively topic. As you can imagine, that COVID-19 still is affecting our lives daily. So we will see several approaches how to do this, how to identify with chest x-ray here, for instance, a COVID and non-COVID case, how we can do this in an automated fashion, using HPC and deep learning together. And then we also go into the neurosciences, which is not directly related to COVID, but also health sciences, understanding Alzheimer's diseases, and also, of course, other neuroscience diseases like multiple sclerosis, for instance. So here you have really human brains cut it into different pieces. Let's say, for instance, 700 different slices of the human brain that we want to analyze for different purposes, and then do a 3D constructions, which brings us to the big brain that one of my colleagues here, Professor Katrin Ammunds, was publishing in this particular paper. So we look on this data science problem also from the perspective of HPC, but really picking also several different pieces which are quite interesting, like the Docker and Singularity here, which enables container technologies to use with tools like DataLet, which are Git-based tools in HPC environments as well. So an interesting topic, which is, let's say, not directly physics-based, which is this topic. So lecture 12 is really one of the traditional fields of HPC, computational fluid dynamics and finite elements. We will have one of my PhD students really talking about it also in detail out of our simulation and data lab from the CFD. And you will see and understand liquid flow, the different methods that lay behind it, Navier-Stokes method, also the Lattice-Boltzmann approach. We have to understand a little bit the large eddy and turbulence, why that is so computational problematic. We have then also infinite elements in this part, a little bit the idea of, okay, I have large simulations. I maybe don't want to chop everything into the classical elements, which you see here, maybe just into every square is equal. Maybe, as you see here, as the fire evolves over time and the smoke, we want to have coarse-grained grids and, let's say, more small-grained grids, depending on the, let's say, impact on the computation on these fields. And we look on crash tests and so on. It's a very interesting topic and requires enormously HPC, but also shows you where HPC is used today enormously in practice by engineers worldwide. In systems biology, we look then in the very small, right? You see here that from proteins, you can, in protein folding, maybe understanding again Alzheimer's diseases, you can come up to different regions. We had the brain in the previous lecture. You see and get a feeling for the simulations on different scales, but then also think about bioinformatics, where you then think more about RNA and you know, DNA will understand this concepts a little bit of gene sequencing and what really the role of databases is in this, and also the web portals that then give you access to HPC machines. In lecture 14, then we really go to the very small, the force fields I was alluding to, molecular docking, molecular dynamics that is used still in drug discovery today. So you would see that, let's say, two drug elements, they will perform first a molecular docking if they fit at all. So the ligand will be basically docking to the molecules in order to create a new drug. But we will see also that this is just half of the parts. They have to stick together over time, which brings us to molecular dynamics, so simulations over time of these bound of this potential new drug. And with this, you can identify if they stay together or if the force fields of these different molecules will drag them apart. So there are different libraries, which is really the key part of this lecture here. And we will understand how this is, of course, then affecting larger materials. So based again on molecules, of course. Lecture 15 then is on terrestrial systems and climate. I already talked about that if we want, for instance, to understand the water flow here, we have to consider the atmosphere with a Cosmo model in parallel, the land surface model in parallel, interacting, and then, of course, the subsurface with a par flow. All of these are different parallel simulations that in these simulations, to make it real, have to work together, which brings us to this path flow hydrology parallel application. And here we will really learn that coupling these models is possible, and we can use several libraries, for instance, but we'll also understand the role of PDEs, partial differential equations, a bit more, and how it is with our weather forecast that we have essentially every day maybe looked at, what the problems with it, and what essentially there are in terms of solutions of using HPC, of course, to make these forecasts as predictive as possible. In the final lecture 16, it's more a kind of really, let's say, informal lecture where we look again on what we have learned, prepare us for the final exam and the quizzes, debriefs, and so on. But we really look also in the mindsets of what we have learned, how we can use it now basically on the job market. So we will discuss jobs. We will see and map this to your skills that you learned. Of course, there are also PhD positions and master's thesis topics that will be discussed. And then the tool set really where you can see where you want to go to future topics, maybe in one of our simulation and data labs here in Iceland, or basically internationally want to be part of the larger community if you like to really explore maybe quantum computing, for example, with our D-Wave systems. So just an appetizer for this fall, if you're interested in parallel computing and not have taken it in the last fall, where I know some of you have already participated in that one. In this fall, there will be again the cloud computing and big data course happening, which is really a complementary program to the HPC one. It has more cloud approaches, meaning we look more into Azure, Amazon, Google, but inherently have lots of, let's say, knowledge already from this course in terms of parallel computing, distributed computing. You know what GPUs are. There we go much further in using parallel and scalable machine and deep learning really with big data on this cloud computing systems. We explore a little bit the Hadoop world and Spark world of Apache, so Apache projects, HBase, and so on. A little bit different paradigm of parallel computing. If you're interested, the materials are also on this website and can look at and to make your mind over the fall after this HPC course. That's all basically I wanted to show today. I would like to conclude, however, with an interesting motivational aspect that, high performance computing is not always very dry. There is also fun in it. And I think this video explains it quite well from Dreamworks. And I just show that to you as an appetizer for the course again, that we have also definitively not only hard parallel programming, but also fun along the way. So I hope everybody is motivated to join the course, to continue being active in the course, and really want to learn more. That's really all I wanted to leave you on the table for the prologue. I'm available per email for more questions. We have a discussion section also for the whole course in Canvas. Please use it. And basically, we'll see on Thursday then the next part of the course lectures coming out. Just a short acknowledgement about some of the gentlemen here that you see that are also helping me in research, but also conduct many of the examples that you will see throughout the course on behalf of with me and basically with me. And some of the PhD students you see here and postdocs will also present during the courses. With this, thank you very much for joining this course, and I'm looking forward for our next months together.